This is Chad Brown with Chad Brown Law. I have been going through in these series of videos the sequential evaluation process. The sequential evaluation process is the process the Social Security Administration goes through to determine if someone is disabled. And it goes through a 5-step sequential evaluation process in every case to determine if someone's disabled. So today I'm going to talk about step 2 of the sequential evaluation process. Step 1 looks at SGA, or substantial gainful activity, which is an earnings question. And if you make too much money, you lose at the process then, but if you don't, you go to step 2. So what's step 2? Step 2 looks at what are called medically determinable severe impairments. I like to tell people, in some respects, all that is just a fancy way of saying, is there anything wrong with you? But it's actually a little more technical than that. And actually, each of the steps of the definition probably deserve their own video, and maybe we'll do that at some point behind the lawyer's desk or something like that. But today I just want to kind of go through what an MDSI, or a medically determinable severe impairment, is, just to give you some structure for how the government's going to make that decision. So here I am back with my board here, and you'll see here we're at step 2 of the sequential evaluation process, which is medically determinable severe impairment. And how do they define? How does the statute define MDSI? Well, first it says you have to have an impairment that's you have to have an impairment. There has to actually be something wrong. It has to either be an anatomical impairment, a physiological impairment, a psychological impairment, and of these they have to be an abnormality. So basically what they're saying is an impairment is an anatomical abnormality, a physiological abnormality, or a psychological abnormality. And generally the abnormality has to in some way preclude work or affect your ability to work at some level. So one of the things that comes up a lot, though, that we deal with a lot is, well, how do you prove you have a medically determinable severe impairment? And the statute's very, very clear about this. What the government has said is that you must establish your abnormality, your impairment, by objective medical evidence from an acceptable medical source. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Both of those phrases are completely loaded with tons and tons of question marks. In some respects, I believe they can create more confusion than clarity, but that is what the rule is. The rule is you have to show that you have an abnormality by objective medical evidence from an acceptable medical source. So what is objective medical evidence? Well, I think sometimes it's easier to define things by what they're not than what they are. What is objective medical evidence is not your complaint of symptoms. It is not the diagnosis that your doctor gives you. It is not your third cousin Susie's statement about all of the things they observe you dealing with. That is not objective medical evidence. You need to think, I'm at the doctor's office, they did an x-ray, they did an MRI, they did an exam, they did a test, they being the acceptable medical source, which is another issue about what counts as an acceptable medical source. For purposes of this video, you just need to assume that it needs to be a doctor. It doesn't have to be a specialist. It can be anyone who's a medical doctor. There are some other sources that are allowed, but it gets a little hazy sometimes when we're talking about nurse practitioners and chiropractors and what's going to count with those. We'll deal with that later in another video somewhere. But for purposes of understanding what a medically determinable severe impairment is, it's an anatomical, physiological, or psychological abnormality. It has to be demonstrated by objective medical evidence from an acceptable medical source. That's why when people come to see us, they do intake, and they're like, why do you want to know all the doctors I've seen? Why do you want to know all the hospitals I've been to? Why do you want to know all the testing I've done? I can't remember all that. Well, the reason is we cannot establish a medically determinable severe impairment without objective medical evidence, which is what's found in your medical records, from an acceptable medical source. And so not only have we confirm the evidence is there, we have to make sure that it's from a source that's going to be considered acceptable. So in the sequential evaluation process, when you get to step 2, you must demonstrate that you have an abnormality, objective medical evidence from an acceptable medical source. If you don't, the process stops right there. There are questions about what makes it severe. There are questions about sources and the objective nature of the evidence that can be debated, but generally Uh, Most impairments, if they're severe enough that led you to apply for disability, are going to get you through step 2 of the process. People do lose at step 2 of the process, but typically that's not what happens. Usually you're going to get through the process, and you're going to go on to then look at step 3 and look at listings to see how severe are these abnormalities and impairments that you have. And then in steps 4 and 5, you move on to look at how those impairments affect your ability to work. But step 2 is just looking at MDSI. Do you have a medically determinable severe impairment? If you do, you get to move forward in the process. If you don't, the process stops there. So we'll talk about the other steps later, but I hope that helps.